The book of Exodus is a book that is full of familiar stories. The story of the burning bush, Moses being rescued from the Nile River, the parting of the Red Sea, the plagues. But one of the most familiar passages is the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. But there are two elements of this section of Scripture that I think are often overlooked. They're subtle things, but vastly important. So if you got a Bible, flip to Exodus chapter 20, and just let me point out two things from the Ten Commandments that may have slipped your notice. First of all, the passage begins, and God spoke all these words. And that reminds us that in Jewish thinking and Hebrew thinking, the Ten Commandments are really the 10 words, which opens up the possibility that they aren't just commands. In fact, the first word, according to the Hebrew reckoning of the Decalogue, which means 10 words, the first word is actually not a command. If you were to ask Jesus or Peter or Paul or any good Jew, what is the first word in the Decalogue, they would say to you, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Those are the first words, that is the first statement out of God's mouth in the Decalogue when he begins to speak all these words. Now that means that the Jews then have to combine a couple of the commands so that they still end up with 10. And they have combined the first and second command, which is don't worship other gods and don't make idols with your hands. Don't make graven images. Well, that makes sense. Both of those commands really deal with pagan worship of other deities. They really are one and the same word. So the first word is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. This is so important to see that the Decalogue, what we usually refer to as the Ten Commands, begins with a statement of relationship and authority. I am the Lord, right? That means that the commands that do follow this first word are not simply suggestions. They are commands from the supreme deity who alone determines what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong, what is blessed and what is cursed. He is the one who is the arbiter of good and evil. I am the Lord. Therefore, what follows is true of me, and it is true of the world that I have created, and reflects all the things that I, as your God, value. So the Decalogue begins with a statement of authority, but it also highlights relationship. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. The covenant is rooted in relationship. And the line of thinking in prophets like Moses, who received the Ten Commandments, is that Israel is in a relationship with God because he is their God and delivered them from Egypt. Therefore, Israel should be grateful, and that gratitude should then lead to obedience. Therefore, here are some commands to obey. Don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Right? Don't do these things because they reflect something deep that God values. Human life, human sexuality, the safety and goodwill of others. These are things that God values and are expressed in the commands that follow. And these are not options. These are authoritative commands given by the one God who both has authority, I am the Lord, and who is in relationship with Israel. And because of that relationship, Israel is called to obey and reflect their God. So I think it's really important to understand that, like Israel, we don't simply get to choose what is right and wrong. We are not the arbiters of good and evil. Only Yahweh is the arbiter of good and evil. And so the Decalogue, or what we would call the Ten Commandments, begins with this statement of God's absolute authority. It's also interesting where the Decalogue ends. The first four commands are essentially about Israel's relationship with God. Don't worship other gods. Don't make graven images. honor the Sabbath, which is God's day set apart to commune with Him. Don't take God's name in vain, right? These all have to do with our relationship with God. These are followed then by commands that deal with our relationship with others. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, right? But the last command, Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, is different from all the commands that preceded. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, how is this command different from the commands that precede it? In one significant way. All of the other commands prohibit some sort of sinful act: murder, stealing, sexual misconduct. But the final command that wraps them all up is a command that deals with what is going on in the heart and in the mind. Thou shalt not covet, right? These are not acts, they are thoughts and attitudes that rest in the heart and the mind. And so the Decalogue concludes with an admonition to guard our hearts, to guard our minds. Because if you covet your neighbor's house or ox or donkey long enough, you might actually commit the sin of stealing from your neighbor. If you covet your neighbor's wife long enough, you might actually act on that and commit some act of sexual infidelity. So the final commandment reminds us that the law is not essentially concerned with specific acts. It is ultimately concerned with the orientation of the heart and the mind. This is where the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, ends, with this admonition to guard what is happening internally, so that if our internal orientation is correct, we will then act through external acts in a way that reflects God's concerns and God's values. And this is good news for us, that the law of the Old Testament is not some legalistic list, but is very much rooted in relationship and very much concerned about what is going on internally in each of our lives. So I hope from now on, when you read the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments, you won't miss those two bookends of this section of Scripture, which are absolutely important for understanding our relationship to God.